Okay, so having used the images to generate some ideas, what you need to do then is to go on and create a working plan, a structured plan that is going to help you produce a really effective imaginative writing response. Effective planning means using the whole 10 minutes available to you. All right, don't skimp on the planning, because the piece you produce in the end won't be as good if you don't bother to plan. Make sure your plan is focused on the topic specified in the task. So write it in the middle, write it on the top. Don't write out the whole task. Just write out the topic or the theme that you're being asked to do somewhere prominent on the page so that you can see it and you can make sure that all the details you're thinking you're going to include are actually related to that particular topic. The first thing you must do is decide on the narrative voice. You have to decide what point of view you are going to write your response from. So you have options. Obviously, you could write in the first person. That would be a limited viewpoint. You might want to write in the voice of a child, or in the voice of an elderly person, or in the voice of an animal. You might want to personify an animal and write in that voice, should that be appropriate for the task. You might decide to use the third person voice. You might decide to use a very traditional omniscient narrator who's all seeing and just telling the story. Okay, you may want to have a couple of narrative voices and switch between the two of them. That's absolutely fine. Whether you're writing a narrative, a monologue, or a piece of description, you must decide on the point of view, the narrative voice, before you do anything else. When you come to plan, you should be looking to plan content for 4 to 5 paragraphs. In 30 minutes, you should be able to write 4 to 5 paragraphs. Okay, if you are producing a response that is a narrative, which is very, very likely in most instances, then you're likely to use a very traditional 5-part narrative structure. If you create a plan that has 5 bits to it, each of your 5 paragraphs can be one of the parts of the 5-part narrative structure. Okay, and it makes it much simpler for you, and you know where you're going with it. Make sure that on your plan you're including notes on specific imaginative language and structural devices that you're going to use. And because this is a working plan, you're going to keep coming back to it and ticking these things off as you're writing to make sure that you're writing the response you intended to write. The last thing to say is plan in any way you like. Use any method you like. The only person that needs to be able to understand that plan is you. The plan will not be marked directly. Therefore, it won't gain or lose you any marks directly. If you don't have a plan, you will lose marks because the piece you produce won't be very good. If you do plan, you will get more marks because your piece will be more effective. Right, let's have a look at the options for planning a piece of imaginative writing. Some of these will be very familiar to you, some of them might not be. So the first one, most people have heard of spider diagrams. They're really quick, really simple. They're great for helping you maintain focus on the topic because you write the topic in the centre of the spider diagram and then you just splurge your ideas around that. Okay. The problem with that is that although it's good for getting ideas down quickly, you will need to then go back and organise those ideas later into the 4 or 5 paragraphs and add extra details on there. So let's have a look at a spider diagram plan for the task 5 that we looked at, the one that was asking you to write about learning to do something new. So here's our spider diagram. You can see in the centre there we've got the topic, trying to learn something new, and I've gone round clockwise. So I'm going to start with learning to drive. That's going to be the thing that I'm going to write about. I'm going to write about the first lesson, practicing with my dad, the difficulties I had, how I overcame those difficulties, then the nervousness about taking the test, passing the test, and then my first solo journey. That's fine. That's a really quick way to get my ideas down. But looking at that plan, I can't easily see where my paragraph divisions are going to be. So I need to go back to that and to rework that and spend a bit more time on that. So let's look at another similar option for planning, and that is mind maps. Now, done properly, mind maps have different coloured branches, they include pictures and all sorts of things. For the purposes of an exam, you don't have time to do that. Mind maps in an exam setting are basically a more logical, detailed, structured form of spider diagram. They're more useful than a spider diagram because they can help you with the development of plot and also with the structure of your piece. So let's look at the same plan again, rendered as a mind map. So again, we've got trying to learn something new in the middle. But you can see I've divided it up into 5 sections. So my first section is going to be learning to drive. That's going to be my first paragraph. And in there, I'm going to write about my first lesson, practicing with my dad. I want to make that exciting because that's going to be the start of the story. So I'm going to use some sensory language in there to really appeal to my readers' senses. My next paragraph is going to be all about the difficulties I had, the fact that there was so much to learn. I didn't think I'd ever be able to do it, how I eventually overcame those difficulties. And in there, I'm probably going to use a bit of humour. I'm going to appeal to the examiner's shared knowledge of what it's like to learn to drive. I'm going to use some humour, I'm going to use some figurative language as well, some metaphors, some similes and some personification to really bring that section alive. I'm then moving to the climax, the main event in my story, and that is taking the test. So I'll start about how nervous I was before I took the test, then what it felt like to pass the test. This needs to be a really tense section, so I'm going to use short sentences, I'm going to use lots of verbs in there, I'm going to use lots of single syllable words and really keep the tension high and the pace quite fast in there. My next paragraph is going to be about my first solo journey. So this is the sort of the result of having passed the test. So I'll write about the sense of achievement, and I'll write about the feeling of being an independent adult. That section I think I want to make emotive. So I'm going to use lots of adjectives and adverbs in there to add interest. And then I intend to finish my response by writing about driving today, why it's important to me. I live in a village. If I want to go anywhere, I need to drive. I have children that I need to drive around. The fact that it's easy, so when I drive today, I can drive very safely with the kids having a fight in the back of the car. You know, I don't need to think mirror signal manoeuvre, oh, which foot do I use, how do I put it into gear? I can do that sort of automatically. As that's the ending of my story, I'm going to go back, I'm going to use some humour again, like I used at the beginning, but I'm going to make these personal, real examples, but I'm going to convey them using imaginative writing techniques like humour. I may also use some figurative language in this section as well. So you can see the similarities between a simple spider diagram and a more developed mind map, and hopefully you can see how much more useful a really basic mind map is. And this is a basic mind map. It's not colour coded, it doesn't have any pictures, the branches only go so far. They can be very elaborate. This is a very simple one, but you can see that actually that would be a good working plan for that particular response. Another favourite option is the bullet point list, and for many people this is the easiest thing to do, and it works. It can help with structure, it can help with the linking of ideas if you do it well. So let's look now at the plan for that task rendered as a bullet point list. So you can see again I have 5 bullet points. Okay, my 5 bullet points are my 5 paragraphs, and I've indicated the content of those paragraphs. And then in a different colour I've made some notes about the kinds of techniques that I want to use, the language devices that I want to use in there, okay, and maybe some of the structural devices. So you know, I might use the short sentences, I might use single syllable words, that sort of thing. Okay, so you can see that that again, like the mind map, would be a really good working plan, because I could do it I could create that plan quite quickly. I could come back and tick off all the things that I was using. So again, a really simple but effective way to plan a response. Now, in many instances, the response you produce will be a story. Most of the stories that we read or that we see at the cinema or on the TV follow a very simple 5-part structure. So a really effective way of planning a narrative response is to use a 5-part narrative map. It is great for ensuring that you use that 5-part structure. So in terms of the marking for the examiner, they can tick off the structure thing because they can see that you've deliberately planned the structure. So let's have a look now at how that would work. The 5-part narrative structure is a bit like a pyramid because everything's building up to the climax, the main event in the story. Every story has some kind of setup phase, an establishment phase. In some stories that will be where the characters are introduced, but it's where they set up the sort of the premise of the story, what's going to happen in that story. So for me, again, this will be my first paragraph and it's all about learning to drive. From that establishment phase, we then move towards some kind of complication or some problem that tends to be introduced. And again, for me, this is going to be the difficulties and overcoming those difficulties. This phase is sometimes referred to as rising action. So the tension is kind of rising and it peaks when we get to the climax. And again, here for me, that's going to be taking the test. After the climax, the main event, we then get the reaction or the consequences of whatever that main event has been. This is sometimes referred to as falling action because the tension starts to drop. For me, that's going to be the first solo journey, and the tension then falls even further as we move towards the resolution of a story where the loose ends are tied up and there's some kind of closure. Doesn't always have to be a happy ending, can be a twist or can be a sad ending, but for the purposes of this response, that's going to be my information about driving today, how easy it is and how important it is to me. Now, if you're writing a story, you do ideally need all 5 of these parts, so the setup, the complication, the climax, the kind of the consequence and then the resolution. But you don't have to have them in that particular order. You could start your story with the climax and then go back, or you could start right at the end and then tell the story through a series of flashbacks. And again, that can be a really powerful, really effective way of telling the story. So there are some options for planning, whether you're planning question 5 or question 6. You need to choose whichever way of planning works best for you, whichever one you're actually going to use as you go forward and write your response.